Was simply short covering or something more fundamental. Plus, Gerald Celente is back on the show to weigh in on the Saudi-Yemen conflict, along with what's going on in Europe right now. And it's almost the end of the week, which means it's time for our weekly accrued interest segment. We put you, the viewer, into the driver's seat by fielding your questions and comments live on the show. You definitely don't want to miss a moment, and it all starts right now. Oil futures jumped more than 6% Thursday following the start of Saudi Arabian airstrikes in Yemen. Saudi initiated the airstrikes in an effort to defend Yemen's existing government against Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. Houthi rebels have driven the Yemenis president from the capital of Sana'a. However, the military operation against Yemen hasn't yet affected the oil facilities of other major Gulf producers. Fears that the conflict could spread stoked concerns about Middle East oil shipments, which caused oil prices to rally for a second straight day Thursday. U.S. oil pushed above $50 a barrel for the first time since March 9th, rising to $52.48 a barrel on the New York Mercantile Exchange. Analysts say that they expect only a temporary lift to oil prices and doubt the possibility of an all-out war because worries about oversupply still persist. Other financial markets were also shaken. Gold was gaining as a haven investment on Thursday, and stock markets in the Middle East and Europe slumped. Benchmark Brent oil jumped 5% before trimming gains as the dollar rebounded from Wednesday's drop, making dollar-denominated commodities costlier in other currencies. Now, Yemen produces a relatively small amount of oil, but Arab producers have to ship their crude past the Yemen coastline via the Gulf of Aden in order to get it to the Suez Canal, which is a key passageway to Europe. 7% of the global oil maritime trade passes by Yemen's coast, and that's where things could get a little dicey for the global oil markets. The waters between Yemen and Djibouti, known as the Bab el-Mandeb, are considered by the U.S. Energy Information Administration to be a choke point for global oil supplies. The EIA estimated that 3.8 million barrels per day passed through the waterway in 2013, and Egypt sent naval vessels Thursday to help secure the passage. The question now is, was Thursday's bump in oil prices simply just short covering or something more fundamental? For all of our sakes, I hope it's the former. To expand on the geopolitical effects of current military operations in the Middle East, Gerald Celente is back on the show. Now, Gerald is the author and publisher of the Trends Journal. Oil futures jumped more than 6% following Thursday's Saudi Arabian airstrikes in Yemen to defend Yemen's existing government against Iranian-backed rebels. Now, I first asked Gerald if this is just short covering or, again, something more fundamental. Take a look at what he had to say.
You know, tracking trends is an understanding of where we are, how we got here, and where we're going. I want to read you something from the Trends Journal back in December of 2009. As forecast in the Trends Journal, a wild-card terror shock has the potential to cripple the global economy. Oil spikes, market crashes, and financial panic will ensue should a 9/11 magnitude attack hit the U.S. or a major oil producer. It has been scantily reported, but the cross-border fighting between Saudi Arabia and Yemeni Houthi rebels is precisely the type of conflict that could destabilize world oil markets. Should the fighting intensify, the Saudis risk an attack upon their oil facilities, which could curtail supplies, drive prices higher, and seriously damage the already imperiled world economy.
There you have it. You're clairvoyant. You knew how to, that's pretty amazing, actually. That's from your Trends Journal, exactly. So you seem to think that this is more fundamental.
Oh, absolutely. You know, people are only looking at one side of this. And that is that the Saudis are launching this major attack along with their allies.
I want to switch over to Europe, where the data are finally looking up. Now, the Europeans have had a devil of a time getting their economies to grow consistently and have now resorted to central banks printing money and buying sovereign debt. So is this going to help?
It'll help just as much as it helped in America, where the only thing it helped with the equity markets. Oh, by the way, look at the money flowing out of the States into the equity markets into Europe in anticipation of this. It's the greatest rise since probably about 2006. And then you look at the great quantitative easing scheme that they did in Japan. It helped the equity markets. It's wonderful. You just saw the Nikkei again hit new highs, 57% gain since they put in quantitative easing. The only people it's going to help are the same people it helped in the States. The equity markets went from 8,000 when they began quantitative easing in 2009 to essentially 18,000. That's the only people it's helping. Otherwise, it's more austerity measures and more difficult jobs and earning potential for the people that are paying for this.
Now, it's interesting that there were such large and violent protests during the ceremonies to celebrate the ECB's new headquarters in Frankfurt. So, Gerald, the protesters, they didn't have a consistent message. So what do you think about their anger and what their anger says about the ECB in Europe?
You know, you're right. It's very diffused, and you're seeing it also with the election results. Whether it was Le Pen's party, you know, they got, what, 25% of the vote. They expected more. Well, you saw it with the Podemos party recently elections this past Sunday, and in Spain, and they didn't come in as strongly as they thought. You saw the waning of power in Italy with the Five-Star Movement, Beppe Grillo's party. And the Syriza party in Greece, it's not doing what they said they were going to do when they got elected in fighting the austerity measures. So the pressure is there, but the organization lacks. But when you look at the fundamentals of how many people are really unhappy with this, I believe it's going to take a spark, something to ignite the people in a way they haven't been ignited before. But right now, it's a flat line of descent.
Where do you see the Eurozone economy heading this year?
It's going to be just as it is now. Again, the only growth you're going to start seeing again, if at all, is in the equity markets. There's a global slowdown. You know, we talked about what's going on in China. You look at the data coming out in the United States with durable good orders. You go back and look at retail sales. You look at the job growth. It's flat. It's a flat line. It's more of the same, but probably a little bit worse.
Now, after some success in 2014, Greece is really struggling, and that's mostly due to the wrangling over its bailout program. A bailout that benefited Germany and French banks, might I point out. So who has more economically sound position in this whole fight here? Is this Germany or Greece?
Oh, it's Germany. I mean, Germany's controlling the whole European Union, basically. They're the ones that are making the money. They're the ones that are exporting most of the product. They're the ones that have a relatively low unemployment rate compared to the rest of the Eurozone and the Euro group. You know, it's the golden rule. Those that have the gold rule. And Germany has the gold. And they'll be calling the shots. And we're going to have to see if the Syriza party is going to do what they said they were going to do in their election promises, and that is they wouldn't bend to the austerity. My guess is they will, because they're politicians, and politicians always say something to get elected and then backtrack on what they promised. And I believe that's what they'll do in Greece.
And Greece is a country of what? I mean, 10, 11 million people, and it has a GDP of $250 billion. Now, the U.S. has 320 million people and has a $17 trillion economy. So that's more than 60 times the size of Greece's. So why should we care what happens there? Why does it matter globally?
It matters because of the stability of the Eurozone and the Euro group, the Euro currency. So if Greece were to pull out of the Euro currency, then you're going to see other countries start considering doing it as well, from the people movement up. And again, that's the only reason we're even talking about Greece, is because the people voted in the Syriza party thinking that they were going to really stand against the austerity measures being imposed upon them. But even so, the Syriza party was still pro-European group, in other words, staying with the currency. And then again, you're looking at the trends, how we got here, where we are, and where we're going. As you look back, and as we saw as it was happening, Greece should have never been in the Euro group to begin with. They cooked the numbers to make it look like they didn't have the debt and the liabilities that they had to bring them in. And by the way, the guy that helped them cook the numbers, oh, that was Mario Draghi, the guy that's now the head of the European Central Bank. At the time, he was the head of the Goldman Sachs gang's European division.
Time now for a very quick break, but stick around because when we return, Richard Wolff will be on the show. The Marxist economist sat down with us to share his views on the U.S. and European economies. And it's almost the end of the week, which means it's time for our accrued interest segment. Ed, Bianca, and I are fielding your questions, comments, and concerns sent in throughout the week live on the show. You definitely don't want to miss it. Plus, remember, you can see all segments featured in today's show on YouTube, youtube.com/boom-bust-RT, and also on Hulu at hulu.com/boom-bust. Now, as we head to break, here are your closing numbers of the bell. Don't go anywhere.
I think the shutdown's pathetic, Larry. We shouldn't have to pay taxes then, should we?
Good idea, Jesse.
But have no fear, because the billionaire oligarchs are here.
What if there were a country in which the government operated outside of constitutional rule?
40% of the food that we produce in the country never makes it into our mouths.
How much fallout do you think this is going to create for the CIA?
Do you think this is what's triggering the crisis?
America's the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
I need to know what to be terrified of. There is nothing scarier than not knowing what to freak out about.
One minute they were working toward the American dream, the next they were just trying to survive the night. It's time for Americans and lawmakers in Washington to wake up and start talking about the real causes of poverty in America.
On in your city, in your streets, never back down like Tyrell, and the truth is what you seek. To analyze, investigate from the bottom to the top. You speak your mind like Sean Stone, whether they like it or not. I got Tabitha, Miss Wallace, with the wisdom and the pearls. Between the outrage and the evidence, what's going on in this world?
Watching the Hawks, watching the Hawks, watching the Hawks. Listen when they talk.
Welcome back to the show. Now, to discuss the U.S. and Europe, Richard Wolff is back on the program. Richard is a visiting professor of international affairs at the New School and an expert in Marxist economics. I first asked him what he expects to happen if and when the Fed raises rates. Take a look at what he had to say.
Several times in the last year and a half, this issue of raising rates has been raised and come to the point where there's serious speculation that the Federal Reserve might do it. Two interesting things about that. First, every time that has happened, the stock market has taken a sharp downward plunge, letting everybody know that people whose lives depend on investing money know that the so-called recovery is very weak and very fragile, and that anything that could disturb it, like raising the cost of borrowing money for a house, or borrowing money for a car, or borrowing money for your child's education, anything that makes that more expensive, which a raising of the interest rate will do, could shatter this recovery and plunge us down. The second thing to remember is that the real pressure to raise interest rates is not about the economy being healthy enough. The real pressure comes from people who are rightly concerned about the vast amount of extra money pumped into the economy by the Federal Reserve over the last 6 or 7 years, and great fear that if that money starts to run after goods and services, we will have an inflation the likes of which we may never have seen before in the United States. They want to preempt, to foreclose that possibility by raising interest rates, even if it means the economy goes down. So it's a struggle between those folks and the people afraid of undermining the fragile recovery that will determine whether the Federal Reserve does or does not raise rates later this year.
Now, in Europe, where growth has been softer, they seem to be picking up, particularly in Germany. So what are key takeaways for you from Europe?
For me, Europe is at a crossroads of the most fundamental sort. The Germans particularly found a way to bail out their banks who were in terrible trouble, like American, French, British banks, and so on. They found a way by giving money to Greece, which couldn't pay back the German banks, money that the Greeks then had to pay the banks in Germany with. In other words, it was the German government using public money funneled through Greek banks to take care of their own banks. In order to make this look okay, they put a tremendous austerity demand on the Greeks, savaging their economy. This worked for 3 or 4 years because the Greeks believed they would eventually get back to where they were. They now understand that's not in the offing, that's not going to happen, and they have refused to go along. They've elected a left-wing Syriza government, which will not play the game. That means that the whole unity effort in Europe, between the Germans on the one hand, with the French helping them, and the poorer countries, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Ireland, Greece on the other, their ability to work out the economic crisis they're all going through in a way that they will all tolerate, that's falling apart, which is why people are leaving the euro, which is why the whole prospect of that part of the world is very, very dangerous.
So what should Europe be doing about Greece?
I think the basic reality is to understand what it is so hard for creditors to understand. If you're a creditor and you lend money to others, it is your job to be prudent, to check whether they can afford to pay you back, to not be so focused on the interest you get and the fees you charge, to make loans that will come back to haunt you if the folks can't pay back. The European leaders, Germany, France, Britain, they didn't do properly what they're supposed to as creditors. They lent without regard, excuse me, for ability to pay back. And they're now suffering the consequences. The French and the Germans are learning that the Greeks, the Italians, the Spanish cannot do it. You have to then work out a deal, suffering on all sides, to rebuild. That is a weakness and a flaw in capitalism. It happens over and over again in the capitalist system for the last 200 or 300 years. You'd imagine people have learned it, but they don't. The creditor wants to squeeze every last bit out, not understanding that if you bankrupt the debtors, it will come back and undermine your economy too. That's where Europe is. The Germans, the French, they don't want to pay a part of the mistakes and the bad economics that they pursued profitably in the 1990s and in the first 7 or 8 years of this century. They don't want to give up anything for that. They want all the burden to be carried by those they lent to. As long as they persist in that, the divisions will grow worse, the binary breakup of political realities will continue, and we will have turmoil in Europe that ramifies everywhere else, including to the United States.
And what about Italy, where economic growth has been so weak for a decade or more? You mentioned it in listing those other countries. So, is the whole infinite growth paradigm just simply flawed?
It wasn't so much the infinite growth paradigm. What's been flawed is let's call it a system of denial. Capitalists since the 1970s, big corporate capitalists, have been moving out of Western Europe and out of North America to India, to China, to Brazil. They go there for no mysterious reason. They go there because the wages are much lower, because those societies are poor and are desperate for jobs, because they will not impose high taxes, they will not have heavy regulations. They are a capitalist dream. And so the capitalists, having made a lot of money over the last 200 years in Western Europe and North America, are basically saying to those parts of the world, hasta la vista, baby. We're going, for the same reasons we've done everything, profits, to another part of the world. And we're leaving you to fight over what is left. And that's what's going on. The rich are trying to hold on to what they have, but in a declining situation, that's very bad news for the middle class and the poor, who are discovering that they're in a long-term period of decline. My own judgment is, as they get clearer about what's happening, they are going to be, and I'm talking about the middle and the bottom, who are the overwhelming majority everywhere. They're going to be less and less willing to continue to live in societies that are becoming more and more polarized between a small group of rich holding on and making profits off the low wages in the third world, as we used to call it, and the mass of other people, which means the kinds of tensions you see in Greece are the kinds of tensions that are building everywhere else. We are in for, to be as polite as I know how to be, a very bumpy economic ride in the months and years ahead.
Accrued interest is one of my favorite parts of the week because I'm joined by these fabulous individuals, Mr. Edward Harrison and Miss Bianca Fascini, and we're going to go through the questions, comments, and concerns of our viewers sent in throughout the week live right now. Give it to us, Bianca. Who said what?
The first one is actually in response to Gerald Celente from Shermanator 1989. He said, I don't think Celente really knows what he's talking about on China's debt problem. He seems to be hoping for a hard landing and looking for ways to support his assertion. I think the truth will be closer to what Steve Keen has said, that China is entering a pothole in the road. The economy will struggle for a while, but it will smooth out soon enough. The Chinese government seems to be aware of the problems our economy has had and are trying to address them.
I mean, I'll start off with this. First of all, Shermanator 1989, great name. That's important.
So
I'm going to point that out.
I do like that.
And secondly, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I don't think it's going to be a hard landing. I think that, Keen has a good... listen, there's arguments on either side, and Celente has made some valid points, but I think I agree with Shermanator on what Keen had to say as well, and that there's going to be a landing, but it's not going to be as bumpy as we think. Ed, thoughts?
I would say that in general, people, they tend to take extreme positions on these, and that catches attention. But in reality, 95% of the time, it's less extreme. I think that they have a lot more policy space than we anticipate.
Totally agree. Anything else? Who else said what?
Yes, the next one is in response to Ann Pettifor. Completely disagree with her emphasis on private debt as the core issue. The private sector is at the mercy of taxation and regulation of who? The public sector. She is right that the government can spend as much as they want because they see an endless stream of people to tax. But what she fails to highlight is that during economic busts, this increased burden in debt servicing forces government to raise taxes, introduce stricter regulation, and force austerity upon the private sector, all in the hopes of manipulating the economy in their favor and generate more revenue.
I want to start here because when I first read this, I kind of agreed with Randy Wen, but then I had a talk with Ed, and Ed, I mean this, you schooled me in a way that I needed to be schooled, because I don't think Randy is he's not ignorant. He wants to know. But give it to us, Ed, your position on this, because now I agree with you 100%.
He's not thinking about, cause and effect. Basically, petafors focus on cause, and the cause is private sector debt spiraling out of control. If you look at, say, Ireland, you look at Spain, they had government surpluses before this whole thing happened. Then they went into massive deficit. So it was the private sector that created those problems. And therefore, we need to focus on that before we actually have busts. Right now in the United States, you could say the same thing is happening in terms of the private sector, that there's some sort of bubble. People are talking about,
Ed. This is when
we're talking about, the shale sector. So
perfect.
Those kinds of things. So when things like that happen and they're big enough, it can have, catastrophic effects on the overall economy. And that's what she's saying happened in the Eurozone, in places like Spain and Ireland in particular.
And you can also look at the subprime mortgage crisis. That was, a private problem before it was a public one. So it's interesting. But that really helped me. So I hope it helps all of you out there as well. Bianca, who else do we have?
Okay, the next one is about Meerkat.
Yay!
The discussion we had just a few days ago. Proprietary computers lost out and software ruled hardware. I expect the same to happen with mobile devices, though I must say manufacturers have been working very hard to establish and retain a monopoly. I pointed out several years ago that Facebook had the potential to take over the web, but I think they're too incompetent. There will always be competition and thus a need for advertising and hence cataloging and searching despite apps. Meerkat piggybacks on Twitter.
Ed, I'm going to let you lead with this on thoughts.
I don't have great thoughts on this. I think that my general take on the mobile web is that it's an app world versus the world that you have on your desktop. And what we're seeing now is that the app world is winning, and that means that those companies that can control the app world will do better. And I think actually Facebook is doing relatively better in that world. Google is not doing as well as they could.
I would completely agree. And if nothing else, if Facebook knows what to acquire. They bought Instagram, and now Instagram is it wasn't a mobile-based app, not initially on the web. I still don't know how to use it on the web. To be honest, I use it all the time on my phone. So I would agree with you on that.
I do have one other thing here that we didn't get to. Here's a quote actually from this guy, Jarvis Jenkins. He said, "Look, guys, if you want more views, we need more Bianca. Otherwise, excellent show as always." I thought that was a great comment.
Jarvis is spot on.
He's spot
couldn't
on.
agree with you more.
And Jarvis, there you go. That's
Thank
why
you
we
so
have
much for
Bianca
including
here.
that one. I'm sad I missed it.
Excellent.
I'm getting told we have time for one more.
Oh, excellent. Okay. This one is about Ed, actually.
Ooh.
The last one that I found.
Bring
I
it
missed
on.
one on mine, but I found one about Ed. This is from Carl Drysdale. "Don't let that Ed fellow get away. He's a great co-host. This show was so good, I watched it twice."
There you go.
Sounds like Carl has
We
a
are
crush
having a
on
real
you.
pat each other all on the back at the same time type thing. It's okay, guys. It's fine. I understand. No, you guys are the best, and show's only getting better. And it's also because of comments like yours out there. So keep watching, keep sending them in, because we don't have any more time to talk about them now, and we want to talk about them later. So drop us a line on Facebook, facebook.com/BoomBustRT, and you can also tweet at us at Aaron Aid, at Edward NH, at Bianca Fascini. From all of us here at Boom Bust, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Ciao.